My dearest father, Edward, what event has transpired upon
activities?
When readers of Kengen Omega have to make sense of Edward's downfall, one thing needs to be recognized. Sandrovich wanted to write Edward Wu out of his story. Although Sandrovich's decision to do so has culminated in the introduction of Gilbert Wu and hints of a conflict that has yet to transpire, the reason behind such a decision continues to remain a mystery, because the consequences of Edward's death didn't have any meaning, especially when you consider Edward's role as one of the most powerful antagonists in Kengen Omega, who was necessary for maintaining tension and moving the story forward by providing Kengen's cast of characters a real challenge. Of course, if it isn't obvious, I find Sandrovich's decision unsettling. Yet, what is more unsettling is the way he went about doing so. Despite Edward clearly demonstrating his physical superiority over the Kure and Wu clans, with many statements reinforcing the idea that Edward was like nothing we've ever seen before, Edward gets trounced by the same guy he dominated moments before, warranting a few questions. Is this a plot hole, an inconsistency in Sandrovich's narrative, or is this in line with the logic that Sandrovich has written into his story and is justified within the limits of his narrative? Although it is appealing to think that this is just another case of poor writing from an already horrendous writer, those kinds of beliefs rarely lead to beneficial criticism, but rather hate directed towards a guy who doesn't even know who we are. Furthermore, there does exist evidence to suggest the latter conclusion, that Edward's downfall does make sense because Sandrovich himself has sprinkled in details throughout his story that better contextualize what happened. So join me as I explain the downfall of Edward Wu. During his confrontation against Rayan, Aereo, and Singh, Edward demonstrated reflexes that not only enabled him to keep track of the movements of a fully removed Rayan, but dodge his strikes and interrupt his techniques before they land. Furthermore, when fully removed himself, Edward manages to blitz past Rayan's reflexes entirely, and with a single punch, managed to send Rayan flying in the opposite direction, leaving him visibly shaken as his blood is drawn. However, considering how strikes thrown from outside an opponent's awareness serve to make those strikes more potent by reducing the opponent's ability to defend in time, and considering that Rayan could not perceive Edward's movements, Edward's power was enhanced in that moment. Nevertheless, Edward's power, even without such amplification, is still sufficient enough to defeat someone like Rayan. Yet, in stark contrast to his dominating performance shown thus far, when compared to what follows, Edward's physical abilities pale in comparison. Before, when Edward's reflexes enabled him to completely shut down the strikes of a fully removed Rayan, Edward is now no longer capable of fully reacting to Rayan's strikes, now being forced to block his onslaught. On the other hand, Edward's movement speed is still enough for him to blitz past Rayan's reflexes because, after dashing at him a second time, Rayan was relegated to taking Edward's punishment, demonstrating how Rayan, much like before, still couldn't react to Edward's movements. Therefore, Edward could still launch strikes from outside Rayan's awareness using his speed. However, Unlike before when Rayan was essentially downed from Edward's blitz, Rayan was more successful in enduring Edward's blows, enough for him to launch his own attacks. Therefore, what happened to Edward is that some of his physical abilities deteriorated, while others were impacted to a lesser degree. While his speed in his removal state was still as profound as ever, being able to take Rayan off guard with nothing but the speed of his movements, Edward's reflexes declined, so much so that he could no longer fully react to Rayan's strikes, with his power declining in a similar manner, with Edward being unable to replicate the same effect as before with his blitz, despite taking Rayan completely off guard a second time. Considering these effects, what could possibly have been responsible for doing so? To answer that question, let's look at some information that can better explain these patterns. What happened to Edward is not a unique phenomenon because the physical capabilities of any character can be subject to change. According to Omori, reaction time drops relative to stamina, with stamina decreasing when damage is taken. Furthermore, after Rayan took the full brunt of Oma's attacks while using the advance, Rayan no longer possessed the strength necessary to maintain removal. Since a bare minimum of strength is necessary to perform removal, and Rayan grew so weak to the point where he could no longer do so, along with Yamashita attributing Rayan's weakness to Oma's strikes. As damage increases, power decreases. Since both reflexes and power decline relative to damage, the only culprit for Edward's declining physical capabilities is the knife wound given to him by Singh, the only bit of damage that he sustained prior to his lackluster performance. Although the impact of the knife itself was dampened by Singh's admission that the poison on the knife did not have an effect, along with Hollis saying that Edward did the removal with his artery, a mistranslation that was later corrected to Edward having diverted the knife away from his artery, essentially ensuring that the knife would have a minuscule effect. After getting stabbed, Edward staggered with his blood being drawn, along with there now being a hole in his neck. Clear evidence that damage was taken. However, I'm skeptical that this line of reasoning that is present in Kengen is valid, because weapons have hardly ever been relevant. Although Gao-Lang says that there exists a massive wall between an armed opponent and an unarmed opponent, with such a difference being only exacerbated as time increases and if the unarmed opponent is wounded, Gao-Lang himself, while having a broken fist, managed to survive his encounter with Longman, a quote-unquote master with his weapon, essentially unharmed, while Cosmo, with most of his ribs being broken in his match with Okoya and being relegated to a wheelchair, was able to dodge all of Longman's strikes. Furthermore, Kuroki was able to directly counter a bullet shot from a rifle, despite not knowing when his opponent was going to pull the trigger. And most blatant of all being Takeyama's massacre of Kitogunji, where an unarmed combatant beat the armed combatant in the most miserable way imaginable. So Gao-Lang is wrong. That metaphorical wall can't exist because time and time again it has been demonstrated that an unarmed opponent can trump an armed opponent. But the idea that Edward could be weakened to such a degree solely due to a weapon is supported when considering that if Mikazuchi Rei was allowed to use a weapon against Yorozuka Saopang, an opponent who outclassed Rei when it comes to both power and durability, being able to crack Rei's bones with a few techniques while possessing some of the toughest bones amongst the human race, Ray, with a weapon, could have ended the match much sooner, meaning that Saw Pang's naturally superior durability and endurance would have been made obsolete, indicating how weapons possess their own merits in a fight, being able to do so much damage that it can make up for differences in durability and power. So while Edward's downfall should make sense considering statements littered throughout Sandrovich's story that serve to support it, it's awfully convenient that Singh's knife even landed, considering how unarmed opponents are more than capable of beating armed opponents, along with the sheer difference in physical ability between Edward and his foes. Furthermore, the excessive hubris that Edward possessed had very little impact on his ability to fight, with Edward performing really well, to the point where he was practically untouchable. Therefore, rather than being one of the key culprits that sealed his fate, as Ario suggests, more than anything, Edward's confidence was completely justified. Therefore, Edward's downfall is not what I would consider a plot hole, because the logic is, at the bare minimum, consistent. Rather, I consider Edward to be a victim of plot convenience, in which a highly unlikely set of events occurred because the writer called for it, rather than it being highly likely based on elements present in the story. Believe it or not, this video required very little investment. Considering my penchant for taking month-long breaks, do not for a second think I can maintain a weekly schedule, because I most likely can't. Although I don't believe Sandrovich has gone against the flow of logic established by his story, it does not invalidate our feelings surrounding the matter. I believe that I speak for a large percentage of people when I say that killing Edward, only to then replace him with his clone, thus making his death anyway worth very little, was a bad decision. In fact, I would go so far as to say that it was a waste of time, because nothing was accomplished. The story hardly advanced forward while introducing a new cast of antagonists whom we have very little confidence in, a view justified by Edward's cruel fate. You know, you hate to see it, to see a series descend in quality rather than see it expand and become greater than the sum of its parts. But that's my opinion, and I hope it will change. As always, this was the cyborg whale named after Italian cheese and a dessert item. Goodbye.